Ethan Cole walked into Manhattan Crown Medical Center, looking like a man who had no business being there. Mud-caked boots, a fraying denim jacket, 36 hours of highway still etched into his face. The lobby smelled of chilled marble and quiet money. Staff moved in pressed white coats. Everything gleamed. He didn't. Ethan stopped in front of the lead cardiologist, a man flanked by the most expensive medical team in the country, and looked him dead in the eye. "You're killing her." The room went still. No credentials. No appointment. No explanation for why a small-town doctor from the middle of nowhere had just driven 2,200 miles to say those 3 words to one of the most powerful physicians in America. What no one in that room knew, what no one had known for 5 years, was exactly why Ethan Cole had come back to the one place he swore he never would. Black Ridge, Montana had exactly 1 traffic light, and it blinked yellow after 9 p.m. Ethan had learned that on his 3rd night there 5 years ago, when he drove through the center of town at midnight and didn't see a single car. He'd pulled over, killed the engine, and sat in the dark so long that the cold started creeping through the windows. He hadn't minded. The cold was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything else. His clinic occupied the front half of a converted auto shop on Dunn Street. The sign above the door hand-painted the waiting room furnished with chairs that didn't match a coffee maker that needed 2 attempts to start every morning. He charged what people could pay, which was often not much and sometimes nothing. A rancher named Walt brought firewood every November. A woman named Donna left jars of pickled vegetables on the porch with no note. Ethan had stopped trying to track what he was owed and what he wasn't. The math never worked out the way it was supposed to. He was good at the medicine. That had never been the question. Most days, that was enough. Lily was 7, and she had her mother's eyes dark brown, wide-set, with a steadiness in them that didn't belong to a child her age. She did her homework at the back desk, while Ethan saw the last patients of the afternoon, and when the clinic was empty, she'd drag her chair over and eat dinner beside him while he wrote up notes. She asked questions constantly about the human body, about why people got sick, about whether a broken bone hurt, more going in or coming out. He answered every one. He figured she'd earned that much. She'd grown up without Sarah, without grandparents nearby, without anyone but him, and she'd done it without complaint, which was more than he could say for himself. He didn't talk about the years before Black Ridge. Not to Lily, not to anyone. The framed photo on his desk, Sarah in a yellow coat laughing at something off camera, was the only evidence in the building that his life had once been different. Larger. Set against a skyline that never went dark. He kept the photo because Lily asked him to. He kept his silence because he didn't know what else to do with the weight of it. The television in the waiting room was on when it happened. Ethan was reviewing a chart, half listening to the background noise of a press conference. Something about a healthcare initiative, a new funding model for rural hospitals. Language he'd grown numb to when the audio shifted. A gasp, a scramble of movement. Then the sound of a microphone stand hitting the floor. He looked up. Victoria Sterling was 43 seconds into her prepared remarks when her knees buckled. She went down behind the podium in a way that wasn't graceful and wasn't slow. It was the sudden collapse of someone whose body had simply stopped cooperating without warning. Security personnel reached her within seconds. The camera didn't cut away fast enough. Ethan recognized the seizing quality of it before anyone on screen had said a word. The Chiron confirmed what he already suspected. CEO Victoria Sterling hospitalized. Condition unknown. Manhattan Crown Medical Center. Manhattan Crown. He turned off the television. The first call came 40 minutes later. A number he didn't recognize, a New York area code he did. He let it ring. The second call came from the hospital's administrative line, which he recognized because it was the same number that had called him years ago to inform him that the internal review board had reached a decision. He'd memorized it the way you memorize things that hurt you without being able to stop. He declined that one too. The third call was a different number, but the voice on the other end introduced herself as the chief of staff, and she didn't bother with preamble. Dr. Cole Victoria Sterling is deteriorating, and we're running out of options. The treatment protocol isn't working. We've reviewed her chart 6 times. We need someone who can see what we're missing." The woman's voice was controlled, but only barely. "We know what we're asking. But if you have any interest at all, I don't," Ethan said, and ended the call. He stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that, watching the light change over the ridge. The sun was going down behind the mountains in the particular way it did in October. No drama, no color, just a slow withdrawal of warmth until the sky was the color of cold ash. His phone buzzed again, a text this time. He almost didn't open it. "Ethan, I know I have no right to ask. I know what this place cost you. But she's going to die tonight if nothing changes, and I don't know how to stop it. I'm asking anyway." Marcus. Marcus Hale had been his closest colleague at Manhattan Crown once. They'd trained together, operated together, trusted each other across 10-hour procedures, when trust was the only thing keeping both of them functional. When Sarah died, and the board opened its investigation, Marcus had done nothing. Not a word in Ethan's defense, not a single question asked about the conditions that led to it. He'd stayed quiet in the way people stay quiet, when speaking up threatens something they're not willing to lose. Ethan had never answered his calls after that. He wasn't sure he was going to answer this one either. He set the phone face down on the counter and went to check on Lily. She was at the kitchen table drawing something with colored pencils, a house with a red door, a tree that was slightly too large for its surroundings. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she noticed him. "Is everything okay?" she asked, not looking up. "Fine," he said. Lily set down her pencil. That was how he knew she didn't believe him. She always set down whatever was in her hands before she said something she meant. "Was that the hospital?" He walked in and sat across from her. She was watching him with those steady brown eyes, and he didn't have a good answer ready, so he didn't say anything. "The lady on TV," Lily said. "The one who fell. You saw that?" "In the waiting room, before Mrs. Ortega came in." Lily pulled her drawing closer to herself, the way she did when she was thinking. She looked really scared when she was falling. Ethan looked at the table. "Is she going to be okay?" Lily asked. "I don't know." "Can you help her?" The question landed with the particular weight that only honest questions from children carry. No subtext, no strategy, just the thing itself dropped directly in front of him. "It's complicated," he said. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the certainty of someone who had thought it through completely, "Mom would want you to save her." He didn't answer right away. He didn't trust his voice to come out level. Sarah had been the kind of person who would have said exactly that. Not as a manipulation, not as a way to win an argument, but because she genuinely believed that was what a person was supposed to do with whatever they had in them. She'd said it in different ways over the years, in different contexts, and it had always sounded like the simplest thing in the world when she said it. It had taken him years of silence and distance to understand that simple didn't mean easy. He looked at his daughter. She had gone back to her drawing. He picked up his phone. They left before dawn. Ethan packed 2 bags, one for him, one for Lily, and loaded them into the bed of the truck, while Lily stood on the porch in her coat, holding her backpack and a stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2 years old. She didn't ask questions. She trusted that he would explain when there was something to explain. He took one last look at the clinic before he backed out of the driveway. The hand-painted sign, the mismatched chairs visible through the front window, the dark street beyond it, the blinking yellow light 3 blocks down. He hadn't left Black Ridge in 5 years. He hadn't let himself. 2,200 miles to New York City. 36 hours if they pushed it split. The driving slept in shifts. Lily could sleep in the back seat, curled around her rabbit, and he would drive through the night the way he'd done things for 5 years. Quietly, without complaint, 1 mile at a time. He texted Marcus as he pulled onto the highway, the headlights cutting through the pre-dawn black. "Don't let them touch her until I get there." The response came in under a minute. "I'll do what I can." Ethan put the phone down and drove east toward the part of his life he'd spent 5 years trying to leave behind. Manhattan Crown Medical Center didn't look different. That was the first thing Ethan noticed when he stepped through the main entrance. The same cold marble underfoot, the same engineered hush in the atrium, the same quality of light that managed to feel both clinical and expensive at once. 5 years had passed, and the building had absorbed them without a trace. He stood there for a moment with Lily's hand in his, and let the familiarity of it move through him like something low and unpleasant. Marcus was waiting near the elevators. He looked older, heavier around the jaw, gray at the temples, in a way that hadn't been there before. He wore his white coat the same way he always had, slightly open, the badge clipped at an angle. When he saw Ethan, something crossed his face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite guilt, but lived somewhere in between. "You made it," Marcus said. "Tell me where she is," Ethan said. Marcus looked at Lily. "I can have someone take her to the family." "She stays close," Ethan said. "Where's the patient?" They moved through the corridor, Ethan, Marcus, and Lily, who kept pace without being asked, and watched everything with her quiet, wide-set eyes. The ICU on the 7th floor was staffed with the kind of personnel that came with the hospital's reputation specialists, whose names appeared in journals, whose schedules were managed by assistants, who were accustomed to being the most credentialed person in any room they entered. 3 of them were clustered outside Victoria Sterling's room when Ethan arrived. They looked at him the way people look at something they don't immediately know how to categorize: the boots, the denim jacket, the duffel bag over one shoulder, the child at his side. One of them, a cardiologist named Dr. Preston Webb, whose name Ethan recognized from 2 landmark studies on ventricular repair, crossed his arms and said nothing. Marcus introduced Ethan with a careful neutrality that acknowledged the awkwardness without addressing it. "Dr. Cole has been consulted. He'd like to review the chart." "He's been consulted," Webb repeated in a tone that put quotation marks around the word without using them. Ethan was already reading. He'd been handed the chart tablet by a nurse who'd moved faster than the physicians, something he noted without comment. He scrolled through the intake data, the imaging results, the medication log. His eyes moved quickly. His face didn't change. The room watched him read. After 2 minutes, he set the tablet down on the nurse's station counter and looked at Webb directly. "The vasopressor dosage was adjusted at 3 this morning. Who ordered that?" "I did," Webb said. Her pressure was dropping. Her pressure was dropping because the inflammation around the pericardium was restricting output. Increasing the vasopressor pushed the heart harder against that restriction. Ethan kept his voice even. "You've been fighting the symptom. The inflammation is the problem." Webb's posture didn't change. "And you've arrived at this conclusion after reviewing the chart for 2 minutes. I've arrived at it after 17 years of cardiac surgery, including 4 years as chief of thoracic procedures at this hospital. The last part came out without heat, a fact, not a weapon. The protocol you're running is going to cause a cardiac event. It may already be too late to prevent one." The room was very quiet. Marcus stood at the edge of it watching. "Dr. Cole." Webb said, "With respect, this patient has been assessed by—" "I know what you've assessed," Ethan said. "I'm telling you what you missed. He asked for a specific echocardiogram, a view angle that hadn't been captured in any of the existing imaging. The nurse who had handed him the chart looked at Webb, then at Marcus, then moved to set it up without waiting for authorization. Webb said nothing. The other specialists exchanged a look. Lily sat in a chair near the wall and opened her backpack, pulling out a book. She'd learned young how to make herself quiet in spaces where adults were doing something important. Ethan caught her eye for half a second before turning back to the monitor. The echo confirmed what he'd said. He pointed to it without ceremony. "There. The restriction is lateral, not anterior. It doesn't show on a standard view. Every drug you've given her in the last 6 hours has been working against her." Webb looked at the image. Something shifted in his expression. Not agreement, not yet, but a crack in the certainty. Marcus stepped forward. "What do you need?" Before Ethan could answer, the monitor at the nurse's station changed its tone. A technician moved sharply. Someone said Victoria Sterling's name. And then the overhead call system activated. The room went from managed tension to controlled chaos in the span of 4 seconds. Victoria's heart had gone into arrest. By the time Ethan reached the doorway of her room, Webb was already calling for the crash cart, his hand up, 2 fingers, pointing the automatic authority of someone who'd run this drill 100 times. Charging to 200 joules, the technician announced. Stop. Ethan's voice cut across the room. Webb turned. Dr. Cole, if you shock her right now, you will destroy what's left of the viable tissue around that restriction. The inflammation has compromised the wall integrity. Ethan moved to the bedside, his eyes on the monitor. Defibrillation will not restore the rhythm. It will end it permanently. The protocol. The protocol doesn't account for what's actually happening to her heart. Ethan looked at Marcus, and Marcus, after a beat that lasted long enough to contain 5 years of silence, 5 years of looking the other way, 5 years of choosing safety over truth, said, "Hold." Webb turned to him. "Marcus, this is completely hold." Marcus said again, more quietly, and something in his voice made it final. The technician's hand came away from the defibrillator. The room turned to Ethan. He worked quickly, and without narration, asking for what he needed, receiving it, moving through the procedure with the economy of someone who had done this so many times that the steps had become something closer to instinct than thought. He'd explained it once to a resident years ago. Surgery wasn't about thinking faster than the problem. It was about having thought through the problem so many times before that when it appeared in front of you, your hands already knew what to do. His hands knew. 3 minutes passed. The monitor traced a line that was flat, then irregular, then, with the particular stubbornness of a body that hadn't yet decided to quit, found its rhythm. Steady. Slow. Present. Webb exhaled through his nose. The technician's shoulders dropped an inch. Somewhere near the door, a nurse pressed 2 fingers briefly to her mouth. Marcus looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the monitor. Lily from her chair in the hallway had not turned a page. They moved Victoria to a private room on the 8th floor. She remained unconscious through the transfer, through the subsequent monitoring, through the long, careful hours, while her body rebuilt its margins. Ethan stayed in the building. Marcus had a cot brought to a consultation room down the hall. Lily slept on it, curled around her rabbit, while Ethan sat in the chair beside her and waited. Webb came by once around 2 in the morning and stood in the doorway of the consultation room without coming in. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, the lateral view. I should have ordered it. Yes, Ethan said. Webb nodded once and left. That was all. It was enough. Victoria Sterling regained consciousness on the 2nd morning. Ethan was informed by a nurse and made his way to her room to check her status. The clinical visit, nothing more. She was sitting partially upright, attached to a monitoring line, looking out the window at the gray New York sky, with the expression of someone recalibrating their relationship to being alive. She turned when he came in. She was younger than he'd expected in person. Despite knowing her age, something about her presence on television had made her seem larger, more constructed. In the hospital bed, she looked like what she was, a person who had almost died and was now dealing with the aftermath of that. "Dr. Cole," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. "I wanted to check your pressure readings in person," he said, moving to the monitor. "I know who you are," Victoria said. "I mean, I know more than your name." She watched him review the readout. "I've known about you for almost 2 years." Ethan's hand didn't move from the monitor. He kept his eyes on the data. "There's a file," Victoria continued. "It was put together by someone who used to work in this hospital's risk management division before she came to work for me. It documents the conditions that led to Sarah Cole's death." She let that land. "Your wife?" He turned to look at her. The anesthesiologist on her case had been on shift for 16 hours, Victoria said. Her voice was steady, deliberate, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this, not because it was easy, but because she needed to get it right. The monitoring equipment in that operating room had been flagged for malfunction twice in the prior month. The service request was denied on budget grounds. 3 people who were present that day signed non-disclosure agreements within 48 hours of her death. One of them was paid directly by the hospital's legal fund. She stopped. The review board findings were edited before they were filed. Ethan stood very still. "There's more," she said. "And I'm sorry to be the one telling you this because I know it's not something you can unknow." Her jaw tightened. "My family held an indirect financial interest in the investment group that managed this hospital's operating capital at the time. I didn't know that when I started investigating. I found out 14 months ago." The window threw a pale rectangle of light across the foot of her bed. Somewhere in the room, the monitor continued its quiet, reliable work. Ethan said, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you saved my life," Victoria said. "And because the file has been sitting in a secure server for 2 years, while I waited for the right moment, and I've just learned, fairly definitively, that the right moment doesn't wait for you." The press release went out before noon. Ethan learned about it the same way the rest of the country did a notification, a headline, the particular velocity of a story that had been pushed with intention and resources behind it. The hospital's communications team had worked quickly. The statement was precise and damaging in the way that statements are when they've been drafted by people who do it professionally. Dr. Ethan Cole, a former Manhattan Crown staff surgeon, who was forced out of this institution following a pattern of professional misconduct, gained unauthorized access to patient Victoria Sterling's care under the guise of emergency consultation. Sources close to the hospital's leadership indicate that Dr. Cole has maintained a years-long vendetta against Manhattan Crown following disciplinary proceedings, and that his reappearance at this institution represents a deliberate and premeditated attempt to use a critically ill patient as a vehicle for personal grievance. The hospital is cooperating fully with relevant oversight bodies. There was a second document circulating by mid-afternoon, a psychological assessment attributed to no specific author, characterizing Ethan as unstable, grief-driven, and disconnected from professional standards. It had not been created by anyone who had ever treated him. It had been created by someone who understood that a document doesn't have to be true to be effective. It only has to reach people before the truth does. Marcus found him in the consultation room standing at the window. "They called me an hour ago," Marcus said, closing the door. He sat down heavily in the chair by the empty cot. Lily was down the hall with a nurse Ethan trusted. "They want me to sign a statement. It would confirm their version of what happened yesterday, that you acted outside the scope of consultation, that your judgment was compromised, that Webb's protocol was the appropriate course of treatment, and you interfered with it." Ethan said nothing. In exchange, they dropped the review they've apparently already initiated on my authorization of your consult. Marcus pressed his palms flat against his knees. "It would protect my position, my license, potentially depending on how aggressive they want to be about it." The city spread out beyond the glass, gray, enormous, indifferent. Ethan had spent years trying to convince himself he didn't miss it. Looking at it now, he understood that what he'd missed wasn't the city. It was the version of himself that had existed before he knew what this building was capable of. "And Victoria," Ethan said, "they're calling her a victim of your involvement. They're going to suggest she was too medically compromised to have meaningful conversations with you." Marcus looked at his hands. "They know about whatever she told you. I don't know how, but they know a conversation happened." "They're moving fast," Ethan said. "They've had practice," Marcus said quietly. The implication of that sat between them without needing to be developed further. Ethan turned from the window. He looked at Marcus, at the man who had once been his closest friend, who had made the worst choice of his life on the worst day of Ethan's, and who was now sitting in a consultation room, looking at him with the expression of someone who understood too late what cowardice costs. "What are you going to do?" Ethan asked. Marcus looked up. "I don't know yet." He held Ethan's gaze. "I wanted you to hear it from me first, before you found out some other way. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. but it was something the beginning of a man choosing differently than he had before, even when the cost was real and the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Ethan picked his jacket up from the back of the chair. He had 48 hours, maybe less, before the statement became the only version of events most people would remember. The hospital had money, legal infrastructure, and a public relations apparatus that had survived scandals before. What Ethan had was a file on a secure server, a doctor who might sign a statement against him, and a recently recovered woman on the 8th floor who had made a promise. He didn't have much. He'd saved a life with less. Marcus signed nothing. He called the hospital's legal team back the following morning and told them in language that left no room for negotiation that he would not be providing a statement. When they reminded him what that meant for his position, he said he understood. When they mentioned the licensing board, he said he understood that too. He hung up and sat alone in his office for a long time, looking at the framed diplomas on the wall. The accumulation of credentials that had, for years, felt like proof of something. He wasn't sure anymore what they were proof of. He called Ethan an hour later. "It's done," he said. "What do you need from me?" Victoria moved faster than the hospital expected. She had been discharged against medical advisement, technically, though the physician who signed the paperwork was Marcus, who noted her vitals were stable and her judgment was intact. She was back in her office within 36 hours of regaining consciousness, which her own staff found alarming and her attorneys found inadvisable, but which she did anyway because she had been waiting 2 years for the right moment and was not prepared to lose another day to caution. The file contained 43 cases, 43 patients who had died at Manhattan Crown Medical Center over a period of 11 years, under circumstances that the hospital's own internal records, the real ones, not the filed versions attributed to systemic failures, equipment, maintenance deferred for budget, reasoned staffing ratios that violated federal guidelines, a risk management protocol that prioritized settlement speed over accountability. The non-disclosure agreements ran to 61 separate documents. The legal fund disbursements totaled just under $4 million paid out to witnesses, former staff, and family members who had been in the particular language of the agreements, compensated in exchange for their agreement not to pursue further action. Sarah Cole's name was on page 31. Victoria's team had spent 14 months verifying the records, cross-referencing the payments, locating the individuals. 7 of them had agreed to speak publicly. 5 had agreed to appear in person. On a Thursday morning, 11 days after Ethan Cole had walked into Manhattan Crown's lobby with mud on his boots and a child at his side, Victoria Sterling held a press conference in a rented conference room 6 blocks from the hospital. She did not hold it in her corporate offices. She did not issue it through a public relations firm. She stood at a plain table with the 5 families arranged in chairs behind her and a stack of printed documentation in front of her, and she read into the record in full the names of 43 people. It took 22 minutes. Ethan watched it on his laptop in the consultation room, where 10 days earlier, Lily had slept on a cot. Lily was beside him now, not watching the screen, but aware of it turning the pages of her book at a pace that had slowed to something that wasn't really reading. When Victoria finished, she looked directly at the camera and said, "This institution has operated on the premise that the cost of silence is always lower than the cost of accountability. It has been wrong about that for 11 years. It is being corrected now." The board meeting was called for the following Monday. Ethan didn't attend. He wasn't invited, and it wasn't his arena. What happened in that room was Victoria's work executed through financial leverage and legal mechanism and the specific, precise power that comes from being the person in the room who has already done their homework, while everyone else is still deciding whether to take the situation seriously. Marcus attended. He gave a full account of the clinical events, what had happened in the ICU, what the standard protocol would have done, what Ethan's intervention had prevented. He had it documented. He had Webb's echo imaging. He had the original medication log with the timestamps. Dr. Preston Webb, to his credit, confirmed Marcus's account without being asked. He sat in front of the board and said without ornamentation, "Dr. Cole's assessment was correct. My protocol would have killed her. I don't know how to put it more plainly than that. The board's attorney tried 3 separate times to redirect the proceedings toward the question of Ethan's authorization to consult. Each time, Victoria's attorneys produced a document that made the question moot. By the end of the 3rd attempt, the attorney stopped trying. The hospital's chief administrator, a man named Gerald Foss, who had held the position for 9 years and whose fingerprints were on more of the non-disclosure agreements than anyone else in the room, resigned before the meeting concluded. He left through a side entrance. 3 board members followed within the hour. A 4th submitted his resignation by email before the official minutes were filed. The federal investigation was opened the following week. 6 members of the hospital's leadership structure were named in the initial filing. The proceedings would take years. Some of them would result in criminal charges. Some would resolve in settlement. The outcomes were not yet written. But the building the institution had cracked open, and what was inside it was now visible. Ethan was in the hospital cafeteria, eating something that passed for coffee, and not thinking about anything in particular, when a man he didn't immediately recognize sat down across from him. He was around Ethan's age, slightly younger, the kind of tired that had settled into a person's face over years rather than days. He set his hands flat on the table. He didn't introduce himself right away, as though he understood that his name when it arrived would need a moment to land. "Dr. Cole," he said. "My name is Raymond Garrett. I was the anesthesiologist on your wife's case." Ethan set down his cup. Raymond Garrett didn't look away. "I've rehearsed this more times than I can count, and I still don't have the right words. So I'm just going to say what's true." He kept his voice level, though the effort of it was visible. "I had been on shift for 16 hours when I walked into that operating room. I knew the monitoring equipment had been flagged. I told myself it would be fine. It wasn't fine. And when the review opened afterward, I signed a document that protected the hospital and said nothing about any of that, because I was frightened, and I made the wrong choice." His jaw tightened. "I've made the wrong choice every day since, in the sense that I've never said this to you. I'm saying it now." The cafeteria moved around them, trays, sliding chairs scraping the ordinary noise of a building that housed both the worst and the most ordinary moments of people's lives. Ethan looked at the man across from him. He thought about Sarah in the yellow coat, the photo on his desk in Black Ridge, the laugh aimed at something off camera. He thought about Lily asking if Victoria was going to be okay. He thought about 5 years of Montana winters and blinking yellow traffic lights and the particular piece of a life that didn't ask too much of you. He thought about what it would mean to hold on to the hatred and what it would cost him and what it would cost Lily and whether it was worth what it had already taken. He didn't forgive Raymond Garrett, not in the way the word implied, not as a clean transaction, a debt canceled, a ledger balanced. That wasn't how it worked, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. But he looked at the man and understood something he hadn't been able to see from a distance. Garrett was also a wreckage. Not the same wreckage, not equivalent, but a man who had made a catastrophic error inside a system that made catastrophic errors routine, and who had been living inside that fact every day since which wasn't nothing. "I know," Ethan said finally. Garrett looked up. "I know it wasn't just you," Ethan said. "It was the equipment and the shift length and the budget decision that didn't fix the monitor and the legal team that drafted the NDAs and the board that approved the policies that made all of it possible." He picked up his coffee cup again. "You made choices inside all of that. Some of them were wrong, but the building made choices too." Raymond Garrett pressed his mouth together for a moment. His hands were still flat on the table. "That doesn't fix anything," Ethan said. "I want to be clear about that, but I'm not carrying it anymore. I can't." He looked at the man steadily. "Whatever you do with that is your business." Garrett nodded. He stood slowly, like someone whose body had gotten heavier during the conversation. He said, "Thank you," and walked away. Ethan sat alone for a while and let the noise of the cafeteria fill the space around him. The reconstruction took longer than the collapse. It always does. Victoria acquired Manhattan Crown through a process that her attorneys described as structured acquisition under distressed conditions, and that the financial press described as a hostile takeover, though neither characterization fully captured what she was actually doing, which was buying the thing that had broken people and deciding to build something different with the materials. She brought Ethan in to lead the clinical protocol, restructuring, not as an administrator, not as a public face, but as the person who sat in the rooms where policies were written and said, with the authority of someone who had seen what bad policies produced, that one needs to change. He was methodical and specific, and in the way of people who have lost something irreplaceable to institutional negligence, deeply uninterested in compromise for its own sake. The hospital was rechartered as a non-profit. The new name, Sarah Cole Memorial Hospital, was announced without ceremony in a brief internal communication to staff before it went to the press. Ethan had asked Victoria to do it that way. He didn't want a ribbon cutting. He didn't want speeches. He wanted the name on the building and the policies in place and the people inside it working under conditions that would not produce what had happened to his wife. Marcus was named medical director of the full network, a position that carried along with its title and responsibilities the specific weight of a man who had been given a second chance at his own integrity and intended to use it carefully. He called Ethan the day of the announcement. "I know this doesn't make up for anything," Marcus said. "No," Ethan agreed. "Do the job well." "I will." There was a beat, and then Marcus said, "For what it's worth, I should have said something 5 years ago. I knew it at the time. I told myself there wasn't enough to go on, that the investigation would be fair, that I couldn't afford to. I had a lot of reasons. I've thought about all of them, and they don't hold up." Ethan listened. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "Not as a formality. I'm actually sorry." "I know you are," Ethan said, and he did. "Keep being sorry. Do something useful with it." He stayed for 8 months, long enough to see the new protocols implemented, tested, and revised, long enough to train the team that would carry them forward, long enough to walk the building and stop flinching at the memory of what it had been. One afternoon in early spring, Victoria came to find him in one of the consultation rooms where he was reviewing a policy draft. She sat across from him and watched him read for a moment before she said, "You know you don't have to stay." Ethan looked up. "The work is in good hands," she said. "Marcus is solid. The team is solid. We can get to a point I think we're already getting close where this doesn't need you specifically anymore." She was direct in the way she was always direct, which he'd come to appreciate. "And I think there's somewhere else you'd rather be." He thought about a hand-painted sign, mismatched chairs, firewood left by a rancher named Walt. "Vermont," he said. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, the small movement of someone who had expected this, but is still glad to hear it confirmed. "There's a town called Hartfield. They haven't had a family physician since the previous one retired 2 years ago. There's a building available. It's very small." "Good," he said. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not a contract, just an address and a name and a brief note in Victoria's handwriting that said, "You know where to find us if you need anything." "Go home, Ethan." He picked up the sheet and folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. He went to find Lily. Hartfield, Vermont had a covered bridge over the creek at the north end of town, and a general store that also served as the post office, and a row of maples along the main street that turned a color in October Ethan had never seen anywhere else. He would spend years trying to describe it to Lily eventually, to patience to himself, on evenings when the light hit them at the right angle, and would always fall just short, because some things resist translation. The clinic was on the ground floor of a narrow white building on Elm Street. He repainted the sign himself, which took 3 attempts, because the second color looked different on the wall than it had on the paint chip. Lily helped with the lettering. The waiting room held a dozen chairs, salvaged, unmatched, arranged in a loose semicircle, and a window that let in the afternoon light in a way that made the room feel warmer than its square footage suggested. The coffee maker on the counter by the reception desk was a different machine than the one in Black Ridge, but it had the same particular stubbornness about starting on cold mornings. He had been in Hartfield for 6 years, when the old man came to the door. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. The clinic was closed. The sign in the window turned to face out. Ethan was at his desk in the back room, reading a lamp throwing a circle of warm light over the desk, and the framed photograph of Sarah in her yellow coat. The cold was settled in the way it settled in Vermont in late fall, clean and total pressing against the windows. The knock came at 7:20. He heard it, and he looked up from his book, and he set it down on the desk, and he went to the door. The man standing on the porch was in his 70s, at least thin coat, a hand pressed to his lower back, the expression of someone who had held out as long as he reasonably could before admitting he needed help. "I know you're closed," the man said. "I'm sorry for coming by this late. It's my back. Been going on 3 days, and I don't know where else to go." Ethan opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "Let me take a look." The man came inside, stamping snow from his boots. The lamp on the desk threw its warm light into the hallway. Somewhere upstairs, Lily was doing homework. She was 16 that winter, and she had already told him what she wanted to do with her life. She'd said it at the kitchen table one evening. The way she said things, she'd been turning over for a long time, setting down what was in her hands first, looking at him directly. She wanted to study medicine, she said, not just how bodies failed, but how systems did. She wanted to understand the distance between what hospitals promised and what they delivered, and whether that distance could be closed. Ethan had set down his fork and looked at his daughter for a long moment. "That's the harder question," he said. "I know," she said. He drove her to the library the next morning and helped her find everything she needed. He had the sense doing it that he was handing something forward, not a burden, but a thread. The same thread Sarah had given him years ago in the way she'd moved through the world, the belief that showing up for people was not a sacrifice, but a calling, and that the difference between those two things was everything. In the examination room, Ethan helped the old man onto the table and ran through the assessment, methodically range of motion point of tenderness, the small tests that told you what the body was willing to say. The man winced once sharply when Ethan's hands found the right spot. "There," Ethan said. "Muscle strain lower lumbar. Nothing structural." He stepped back. "I'm going to give you something for the inflammation and show you 2 stretches. You do them in the morning before you get out of bed." The man exhaled. "That's it. That's it. I thought it might be something worse." "It isn't," Ethan said. He had driven 2,200 miles for the same reason he had opened this door, not because it was convenient, not because there was recognition in it, or reward, but because there was a person who needed help. And he was the one who could give it. That was the whole of it. It had always been the whole of it, even in the years when he'd lost sight of it, even in the years when the grief had made it impossible to feel. He'd lost Sarah. He had not lost that. He picked up his prescription pad and he got to work.